Welcome, everyone. Today we have a really exciting topic and a very interesting guest. He is from my neck of the woods originally, but now he is a professor at MSU, Michigan State University, in physics and astronomy. He has a bachelor's in astronomy from Wesleyan and a PhD from Yale. And we're here tonight to talk about Charles Fort and his view on science, especially astronomy. So hang tight, and I will be right back with Horace Smith. Hey, Horace, welcome. Thanks for joining me today.
Delighted to be here.
And I have to kind of preface this by saying I went down some rabbit holes about Charles Fort. It was a little bit of a bummer, not gonna lie.
Charles Fort is someone I never thought I'd be looking more deeply into. As you said in the introduction, I was for many years a professor in astronomy and physics at Michigan State University, and I'm an emeritus professor still. But that was basically stars, planets, telescopes, all that. And although I had heard of Charles Hoy Fort many years ago when I was probably a teenager, I had forgotten him rather until more recently when he came back on my horizon. And perhaps I should give a little introduction to Fort for those who are not very familiar with him. Charles Hoy Fort is one of the few people whose name has come into use as kind of either a noun or it can be an adjective. Fortean, there's a magazine named after him, the Fortean Times. But he
Mine
was
just came today.
there. It is. I particularly like the comic strip at the end by
Absolutely.
Hunt Emerson. Um, Charles Hoy Fort, however, was born in the 19th century and lived into the early 20th century, about 1932. And his claim to fame initially was one book, a book called, it was a book that was on the what he called the damned articles, the damned phenomena left off of science. So it became the Book of the Damned when he published it in 1919. And he followed that with 3 more books, but the Book of the Damned remains the most popular and best remembered of all his books. And when one speaks of something as being Fortean, one often thinks back to the kind of things that appeared in that book. For things that are unusual, unexpected, falls of fish from the sky, strange lights seen in the heavens, strange things crossing in front of the moon, things that are unusual. And when people think of being Fortean today, they often think of just being interested in that type of unusual phenomenon, cryptids, UFOs, unusual weather. It's very broad. He would go to libraries and spend day after day go ransacking newspapers and old books for unusual phenomena that he would write down that he thought had been forgotten and ignored by science. But it's actual, when you read his work, it's actually he had what he believed to be a deeper belief than just being interested in the unusual. He thought that there were ways in which everything in the universe were connected that were beyond the ways that astronomers or scientists of any kind believed, and that things could be both true and untrue in a way beyond the classical scientific order. And he didn't like necessarily scientists, and astronomers in particular were his bête noire. So when he came in my horizon again, and I looked at his books, and particularly his second book, um, the New Lands, which followed a few years after the Book of the Damned, uh, he goes very heavy against astronomers. Uh, he has one of his lines, I believe, he didn't know what the brain of an astronomer looked like, but he was reminded of fizzles, uh, a fizzle surrounded by revolving excuses. I rather like that picture, and I was wondered whether the excuses obeyed Kepler's laws or not. But uh, reading him over, I thought, that's kind of interesting, but I think I have to take up the banner of the astronomer and defend the astronomers a bit from the at least some of the cudgels of Mr. Fort. Um, Mr. Fort, as I said, died about 1932, so he's been gone for a long time. But his influence remains, both for those who use the term Fortean in that wider context, or for those who look more deeply into what he thought. And he influenced other people, either who followed his beliefs or who used his books as a starting point for other work, of which we may mention the writer Howard Phillips Lovecraft, who I'm also very involved with. So, shall I go on with some of my defenses of astronomers, or do you want to chime in?
So I feel the need to like represent Charles Fort here and play devil's advocate a little bit.
You got to get your mustache on that case. He had a very fine looking mustache, I must admit.
Can you go into a bit about what astronomy was like during the life of Charles Fort? Was there
Astronomy,
anything
yeah.
justified?
Astronomy was changing during Fort's time. When he was born in the 1870s, astronomy was making a transition from the early astronomy of the positions of objects in the sky and the working out of the implications of Newtonian gravity. By the time he died in the 1930s, uh, the early days of modern astrophysics had arrived. The universe had grown from being considered just the stars around us, as many people thought in the later 1800s, to realizing that there were many, many other galaxies beyond our own Milky Way galaxy. And that happened in the 1920s more definitively, so even after the time that Fort wrote the Book of the Damned. It was also a time when Newtonian gravity was found to be incomplete, and Einstein's theory of relativity came into operation, explaining some things that could not be explained by the earlier Newtonian gravity. Now, it was also a time when in physics, quantum mechanics and radioactivity were discovered. So for me, it's a time of change and development. For Fort, I think he was more tied in often to the astronomy as it was when he was growing up, the older astronomy. But he did have some comments on the new science later on. Rather surprisingly to me, he seemed rather skeptical of quantum mechanics. I would have thought with its dualities of wave and particle and objects being in two places at the same time, in a sense, that he would have taken to quantum mechanics. But he didn't seem to, although he didn't have a lot of time before he died to digest the developments in quantum mechanics. He was also rather, I don't think he cared that much, I, not necessarily for relativity, but um, for the worship of Einstein as in the popular press. Now, he thought that a lot of science, and there's some truth to this, was a matter of fashion rather than being a knock on wood, you can bet on this kind of sure thing. And there were these changes during his lifetime. And one can say uh, we went from a universe in which Newtonian masses attracting each other determined gravity to Einstein's general relativity, where we had the warping of space time. But I think he and I have very different views of the implications of that. And I think I'm rather different here than from our old friend of both of us, Dr. Dean Bertram, who I think is much more of a pure Fortean than I am, surely, and who also thinks of science in terms of these paradigm shifts where it goes from one accepted theory to the next. And I agree it does that, but not, I think, as a matter of pure fashion. I think there are generally reasons for that, and one builds upon the other. However, I will pause to let the defender of Mr. Fort speak before I continue.
What came to mind as you're talking about these changes is how I feel about Pluto being a planet. And
Now,
well, I do accept a dwarf planet is still a planet. I'm a short person, I'm still a person. It still was upsetting news for a lot of people my age and older, I think. Um, but
yeah.
I do accept that things change, but Pluto will always be a planet to me.
Sentimentally, I share your view, but I can see the other way to it. Pluto wasn't discovered until 1930, so at the very end of Fort's life, I don't even know if he wrote about it, but the idea of new planets, of course, had been around since the 1840s when we had Neptune predicted to exist before it was seen. And even before that, the planet Uranus being found, oh, that was more of a pure accident. Now, when Pluto was found initially, um, well, how do people find the masses of planets? Well, there were two ways. One by looking at the effect of gravity upon their motion in their orbit. And the nicer way is if it has a moon, you can use gravity, how long it takes a planet at a given distance to go around, the moon at a given distance to go around the planet to get the mass more accurately, usually. Now, at the beginning, people thought the mass of Pluto might be, well, maybe the mass of the Earth, or maybe a little less. Pluto being far out in the solar system, its motion is slow, so we haven't seen it go through a full orbit since it's been discovered. And uh, well, that's pretty big. We have some planets like Mars, Mercury, that have masses smaller than that of the Earth, so no problem. Pluto is a planet. Now, we now know that Pluto has a moon. And initially, one moon was found, then some other objects. But when the mass was calculated more recently, it's found to be much smaller than when it was initially thought, smaller than many of the moons within our solar system, the large moons anyway. And people said, that's getting kind of small for a planet. And then other objects were found comparable or at least the first size of Pluto in the outer solar system. And people said, maybe Pluto belongs more with those icy outer solar system objects than with the inner planets. Its orbit is rather tilted compared to the orbits of the other 8 planets. And they said, well, we either have to include all those other things as planets, ordinary planets, like maybe the largest asteroid series, some of these new icy worlds. So we could add them in as more planets. Or we have to kick Pluto out, or we keep Pluto in, but mostly for historical reasons and because it's not so far out there as some of those icy worlds. And I can see that argument too. Americans tend to like keeping Pluto as a planet because it's the only planet found, at least the object that had been considered a planet, found by someone from the United States. So there may be a little sentiment there too. Either way, it's a naming convention. It by itself, it doesn't really tell you a lot about the nature of the solar system. Some people think by making it a dwarf planet, it puts you in a category, gets you thinking more about the real nature of the solar system. But it's not an argument that I would stand up and fight over myself. Kansas, where Clyde Tombaugh, the discoverer of Pluto, came from, very much wants to have Pluto remain a planet. And I think there tend to be at least parts of Arizona where the Lowell Observatory is located, which discovered Pluto when Tombaugh was there, probably is also fond of keeping Pluto as a planet. But it's not something that stirs me strongly either way.
Yeah. So Fort would have witnessed some pretty cool astronomical events in his lifetime too. There was what was it called? Those comets. I think it was 1913, or not comets. You know what I'm talking about?
Yes, there are a number of strange things that happened during his lifetime. One of which he wrote about in the Book of the Damned, and then in New Lands more. And this was an event of February in 1913. It was a cold winter night, and this initially attracted attention, at least as far as newspapers and such were concerned, in the city of Toronto. People looked up and they saw fireballs going through the sky. And not just one after another, in kind of a parade of fireballs across the heavens. And they weren't going super fast, not like a typical speedy shooting star, more kind of the speed that you see a satellite move across the heavens. And to his lasting regret, Professor Chant at the University of Toronto was indoors when this happened. He didn't see it, but his phone began to ring soon thereafter, and he asked newspapers to publish a call for observations. Of course, this is before of course, long before the internet, before television, even before popular public radio for the most part. And it was the heyday of the newspaper. So every town had its newspaper, sometimes more than one if you were a fair-sized city. And answers began to come into him, and he realized this was something not just over Toronto. This is something eventually, including work done later on, people saw the meteor procession beginning up in the plains of Western Canada, going over Canada, over Toronto, over the tip of Michigan too, if you're in Michigan, on its way to Toronto. Then the procession went over the Atlantic coast states, New York, and maybe New Jersey. And it was last seen by ships out at sea. In fact, ships down south of the equator off Brazil. So the motion was observed over something like a third of the circumference of the Earth. Now, this was interesting to Charles Fort, as you might imagine. It's not something you see every day, and it's interested people who are interested in UFOs ever since. Some people have suggested, more recently than Fort, that these were a procession of UFOs, of flying saucers, rather than meteors. Fort was, in his 1919 and 1920, 23, I think, books, more circumspect, saying they were moving things with lights, but he didn't commit to what they actually were. Because this was long before the heyday of the modern UFO movement that came in 1947. But it was strange objects had been reported in the sky, of course, long before that. In the 1890s, 1896, 1897, there was a mystery airship, probably mystery airships, seen over the western and Midwestern states in the United States. In 1909, there was a mysterious Christmas airship over New England, including Willimantic, my hometown, and probably people were out watching it from Lebanon, Connecticut as well, nearby. And so it was not the first odd thing in the heavens, but people debated ever since what it was. And in fact, some of the people who later were involved in the UFO story turn up in the later history of this. A largely forgotten character, Alexander Mebane, is one of them. Does that ring a bell with you at all, Mebane?
I thought the last name sounded a bit familiar, but I can't place it.
Back in the 1950s, and somewhat after that, but most importantly in the 1950s, Alexander Alex Mebane was one of the most important UFO researchers in the United States, based out of New York City. And he was thought well enough of by J. Allen Hynek, head of the Air Force's Project Blue Book, that they actually exchanged correspondence, which they kept kind of hush-hush. And I imagine that at the time, Hynek may not have wanted it too known that he was exchanging messages with this rather pro-UFO group that Mebane was involved with. But somehow he became involved with the 1913 meteor procession, fireball procession, I should say, story. He became acquainted with Lincoln La Paz, a meteor expert, had recovered a number of meteorites that had fallen to Earth, and who was very involved in the early years of the UFO story in connection with the green fireballs over New Mexico. And La Paz apparently persuaded Mebane to take up the search. Mebane sent letters to hundreds of newspapers and historical societies and Weather Bureau offices over the route that the fireballs may have passed, to see whether the parade was really a uniform motion across the sky, because some people, in particular Professor C.C. Wiley, had said that Chant's early interpretation of a meteor procession being a kind of objects that came from space like meteors that almost but didn't quite go into orbit around the Earth, just as an accident, was wrong, and that it was just ordinary fireball, ordinary shooting star display, and that it did not really travel this long distance along the Earth. Um, and Mebane tracked down enough new newspaper articles to show that to confirm the original story that there was this procession of glowing objects. But even Mebane, after his investigation, a pro UFO as ET at the time, I think he changed his mind later, uh, enthusiast, eventually decided these were a natural phenomenon, meteors, rather than any kind of alien spaceship. But it's interesting that he actually became involved and was published in the scientific literature on this great meteor procession of 1913, um, and was taken seriously in that fashion, although his similar works on UFOs I don't think ever appeared in the scientific literature, although it did appear in its own publications. So there was an interesting intermingling, perhaps mostly behind the scenes, between the people following UFOs, studying UFOs, and the people in the scientific community who were interested in things like meteors and meteorites back in the early days of the flying saucer phenomenon that's largely been forgotten now, and in fact may still be hidden to some degree. One would have to go through all the old records and the letters to see how much of an interaction there really was. But you wouldn't see that all in the scientific literature. It's mostly forgotten. So the final ending of that tale. I've gotten a long way off of the original Fort, but the final ending of this story is that we do think it was this long meteor procession, and the most likely idea is that, as Professor Chant first suggested, objects came in from space, broke apart into these fragments, and the whole procession may not have traveled that long distance around the Earth, but parts of it did, perhaps becoming visible successively. And Charles Fort, I don't know if he would have agreed with that in the end, but he was very interested in putting in the early observations. He read the scientific literature. He read Professor Chant's paper in the Canadian Royal Astronomical Society Journal. So he did read the literature at the time, and he included the early days of the study of that procession in his books. But he included a lot of other things in space that have not found their way into scientific literature, and where I think he cudgels astronomers for keeping out the damn data, not necessarily fairly at times. I think I told you at one time, picture the astronomers picketing Mr. Fort, carrying banners saying, "Fort unfair to astronomers." Uh, and I think he was to some degree. But I can go on along those lines, but I better let you interject some defense at this point.
So, Fort made a lot of generalizations about astronomers. Um, Sometimes it feels more like he's skeptical of humans in general to me, a little bit. He was a bit of a recluse from
Yeah.
what I understand.
At one time, he said he never believed anything he himself had written.
Well, he has written some quite far out there things. He had some very interesting beliefs about what was in the sky, particularly.
Right? He had this idea that when things were seen apparently tumbling from the sky, falls of fish, falls of snails, uh, things like that, that one doesn't expect to fall from your ordinary cloud, he wondered whether there might be some kind of super Sargasso Sea up in the heavens where objects from different worlds, from different universes collected and when conditions were right, they could tumble down into our world. Now, I'm never exactly sure whether he meant that literally or figuratively, in that they kind of moved into our world from another existence. I have to take a little sip here. But he had those ideas, and how much he believed in them, or how much he was trying to get the astronomers stirred up, I'm never quite sure.
He would have
He
been a great sci-fi writer, I think.
he did write one book of fiction uh, that involved these mysterious objects, but I don't think it was ever published. He claimed that his original skepticism of science goes back at least to his high school days. He had a partial autobiography written, and in it he published that there was a professor, I think he used the name uh, high school teacher, Professor Overbunk, which I presume was an alias. And he said the the experiments, the demonstrations that poor inept Professor Overbunk tried to do in class would never work out. If Professor Overbunk was wanting to demonstrate that black objects absorb more sun than white objects, his experiments would show the opposite. If Professor Overbunk was trying to demonstrate that objects of different weight, different form, fell at the same speed in a vacuum, that didn't work either. So I do feel sorry for Professor Overbunk, and sorry a little bit for both Professor Overbunk and for Charles Fort, that Overbunk never apparently explored with the class why the experiment might have given a different result, because that would bring the class closer to the true nature of scientific exploration. If something is supposed to work out and it doesn't, it's probably a reason. Can you track it down? And maybe Fort would have been less skeptical of science if that had happened. But he had also, I think he was very anti authoritarian in every fashion. He certainly, I guess, had a hard time with his father, uh,
Yes.
and accepting the authority of his father and doing what his father wanted him to do. And they had a falling out. And I think that those things all built into a kind of view that if authority says this, I'm going to say the opposite. And sometimes that may be a kind of a deeper part of his writing than just the wonder at frogs or fish falling from the heavens.
Yeah, he was very contrarian. And another thing that struck me is he writes in first person plural, so he calls himself we sometimes.
I find his books not the easiest to read sometimes. He tends to ramble a bit rather than being held to a particular order of going through things. But he was admired by a number of literary figures in his time. He may not have had too good book reviews in the scientific literature, but a number of newspapers, very well known at the time, um, actually came out very favorably in terms of his books. Um, so he did have literary friends, um, and he had people who thought he was just a crank. Both existed at the time, and I imagine to some degree both survive today. But to get the full flavor of Fort, you have to not just see what people call Fortean today, you have to go back and read his actual publications and see what you think of not only his ideas, but his philosophy and the way he presents the ideas, which are kind of sometimes hard to follow in terms of the present day books we're used to reading.
What I struggle with him is why. Why do you think that? They're um, not very linear sometimes,
Oh, I
and
think very far from linear.
yeah, we
Yeah,
go from, point A to point F and then back to C, and it's very hard to connect the dots.
I think that's very true. And he had the idea of, I think you've heard the expression that a miss is as good as a mile. A miss by inches is as same as a miss by mile. I think that's very much the way that Fort comes off at times. If an astronomer gets the mass of Mars wrong by 10%, needs correction. That's as bad as it get as being off by 1,000%. He seems to be rather unforgiving in that way, not terribly charitable, and that shows up in for example, his discussion of the distance from the sun to the Earth, which was one of the things in which he expressed doubts, but never exactly said what he thought, except he thought it possible that worlds were closer together in the solar system than people thought, which of course might have facilitated his idea of the celestial Sargasso Sea. But when he talks about astronomers and he criticizes them for getting different distances, well, you can't compare really the distance that Kepler got in the early 1600s, shortly after the telescope was invented, before Isaac Newton's law of gravity, and you can't really blame astronomers for not getting things quite right back then. I say, Mr. Fort, uh, with a huff, surely you don't expect the astronomers of 1600 to do as well as they did later on. And the fact that they changed is not a pure matter of taste or fashion, but that the toolkit of astronomers and the theoretical tools they have were getting better. And Fort, I think, was rather uncharitable to astronomers in that connection. He uh, would blame them for getting this wrong and that wrong. He criticized in some 1899 eclipse or thereabout that the astronomers got the time of the eclipse wrong by 18 seconds. Now, I thought that was pretty good for getting the time of an eclipse back then, right? In the pre computer days, and not knowing the shape of the moon precisely as well as we do now. But uh, thought Fort thought that astronomers were rather vainglorious, too proud of their own ability to predict things, and uh, that they needed to be taken down a peg or three. And he certainly was willing to be the one to do that.
Now, all sciences evolve over time. We figure things out. Medical science is a great example. When Charles Fort was alive, they were giving people heroin and, there was cocaine and soda. And, we think of that as crazy now. But it's just, a fact of science. It's going to evolve over time. We learn, we have better technology. Why was he so critical of astronomers specifically and not any of the other sciences?
Well, I think one of the reasons that astronomy offered a lot of ready predictions to which he could compare, and also that there are things up in the talking about things visible in the sky that astronomers did not predict, or things that they predicted that didn't happen, is actually a fair more straightforward than trying to explain why certain two chemicals didn't combine in the way that two chemists might have thought they ought to. So astronomers were perhaps an easy target, and there were a lot of stories about things seen in the sky that could be adapted to his purpose. Now, I think he didn't always do the right and get the right things there, and astronomers do from time to time, I have to admit, uh, make mistakes. There is the story of a planet, Vulcan, as some named it, not the one that the Vulcans in Star Trek came from, but this is the 19th century Vulcan, that was supposed to explain some unusual small deviations in the motion of the planet Mercury. And the idea that there was this undiscovered inner planet, Vulcan, that would explain this. This was a theoretical explanation put forward using then the Newtonian gravity of the 19th century. And astronomers searched for Vulcan, but it was near the sun. So you didn't have a lot of time when the sky around the sun was dark to search for this planet. And the few minutes of solar eclipses were one of those times. And then on a number of occasions, astronomers at eclipses thought they had found the object that shouldn't be there, the planet Vulcan. But they never agreed with one another as to where the object was. And those turned out to be mistaken observations. So yeah, that did provide a reason for Fort to chuckle a bit. It turned out in the end that once one went from Newtonian gravity to general relativity, that small difference between predicted and observed motions of the planet Mercury was explained, so that you didn't need the Vulcan anymore, and Vulcan rather vanished from the pages of history. And I don't think it's a thing that's necessarily a wrong idea in the sense that it was unscientific. It was a prediction based on scientific theory, Newtonian gravity, that didn't pan out because there was science of the time was incomplete. And you can make criticisms of those astronomers who thought they'd found Vulcan, either during an eclipse or sometimes passing as a small dot in front of the sun. And there were some people who were actually respectable astronomers who thought they might have found the planet in that way. But all those observations turned out to be erroneous. Uh, and Charles Fort, yes, I will give Charles Fort the right to chuckle over some of the ways that happened, but I don't give him the right to laugh at the idea that there could have been a Vulcan and that searching for it was interesting.
Yeah. So I have to derail the conversation because you mentioned Star Trek. I need the expert astronomer's opinion. Original, The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine. What is the best in your opinion?
The one I favored most, and I haven't seen all of the most recent versions, so I have to leave those out. The one I enjoyed most was Next Generation.
Me too. I just had a very heated conversation with my good friend and sometimes co-host Steve Ward. He is an original Captain Kirk ride or die.
I was a kid still, well, starting to get a little older than being called a kid when the original Star Trek was on. I never missed it. I couldn't. Of course, we didn't have recorders. We had to actually be there watching the TV when it happened. And I loved it at the time. But in terms of the range of interesting stories, in terms of the range of characters presented, I like Next Generation. Of course, it had more years to develop too. The original Star Trek only had those 3 years to figure everything out, and with a budget, and particularly in part of that time, the last year, I think, that didn't allow for a lot of the special effects and things that could have bolstered the program. And I no means say I don't like the original Star Trek. I loved it, still do. Um, I was already since the 1950s a lover of science fiction. Uh, you can see if you've seen Forbidden Planet. Have you?
Yep.
That, of course, is in many ways kind of a predecessor of the later Star Trek, and you see in the movie Forbidden Planet a number of ideas that will later reoccur in the original Star Trek, along with the monsters from the id. I hope I haven't spoiled the ending to that for anyone, but I loved that, and I loved movies that were not quite so well made or prestigious. Giant Claw, giant, silliest looking giant monster bird, perhaps of all times in a monster movie, although it has a number of rivals. Um, Earth versus the Flying Saucers. Those Ray Harryhausen flying saucers in Earth versus the Flying Saucers are, I think, the best, still the best I've ever seen. Uh, the movies like that, so, which indoctrinated me into thinking about the universe and about life beyond the planet Earth in my childhood. I'll watch them today still and enjoy them. Uh, some things are just pure fun, even if
Hmm.
they're silly. Plan 9 from Outer Space.
Oh,
Uh,
yes.
it's the most ridiculous science fiction movie you could imagine, but it's still a delight to watch.
Yeah. So you're from New England,
I
and
am. I grew up in Willimantic, Connecticut, a
the next
small.
town over from my hometown.
Mhm.
Um, so what I know about all of the scientists I know that are from New England is they all seem to love H.P. Lovecraft. And
Well,
I know he was from Providence.
he was. I didn't really, although I read one or two of his stories before I got to college. It wasn't until I read his books when I was an undergraduate that I really began to enjoy him. And that enjoyment was made uh, all the greater when I learned that, like like me, Lovecraft was an amateur astronomer in his youth and had his own telescopes, enjoyed watching the sky. And I was less welcome when reading the first biography of Lovecraft that I came across by L. Sprague de Camp in 1975, when I became aware more than from his stories about his racism and xenophobia. Those are less welcome parts of his life. Though he's a complicated person, he's clearly in some of his letters he's anti-Semitic, but his wife was Jewish, and some of his collaborators and people he thought highly of were Jewish. So he's one of these people that if you probably met on an individual level, he would be uh, generally kind and polite and welcoming, but that he could go off, however, in his letters, particularly to when he thought he was talking to a family member or something who may have harbored similar views, he could go off in ways that seem quite hateful to us today. So a very contradictory character, but who became very influential in writing about the universe of mysterious things, creatures great old ones, Cthulhu or Cthulhu, however one wishes to pronounce it, who was who were beyond human understanding, who didn't care at all about people, but who inhabited the same universe we do, at least from time to time. So very influential, and I still enjoy reading his stories, even with that hesitation. Now he has a connection indirectly with an event that happened in 1909 in Willimantic, and you may have been you may have heard about it in Norwich, Connecticut too. Not Norwich, but Lebanon. And this is the mysterious Christmas airship of 1909. Before Christmas in 1909, newspapers in New England, in particular, began to be flooded with accounts of a mysterious airship seen only at night. And this became particularly widespread in the area around Worcester, Massachusetts, where it was said in that area of Massachusetts a mysterious inventor named Tillinghast, a name that will appear later on in one of H.P. Lovecraft's stories, had invented a new mystery airship, and he was flying it at night to dazzle the crowd below. That exceeded by far the capabilities of all the airships that were known. It's 1909, so it's after the Wright brothers. There are airplanes around. And one of my favorite newspaper headlines appeared right before Christmas, speaking of Worcester, and the headline is "Worcester Palpitates," trying to show the excitement that streets were blocked by people out at night before Christmas. Trolley cars couldn't get through because the people were out looking at the mysterious airship. And Willimantic was another one of the spots where the mystery airship was said to have flown over. And the word got to Providence. Now, H.P. Lovecraft was at the time, uh, he would have been 19 years old, I believe. And he had had the year before kind of a nervous breakdown, perhaps a physical breakdown as well. Uh, so we don't know as much about his life at this time as we do at other times. But he wrote a letter to the Providence Sunday Journal saying he was out right before Christmas. The streets are crowded with Christmas shoppers, and he sees a crowd of them gathered on a street corner, pointing upward. And he's looked over and said, "Wow." He looks up and he says, "He's a light," and says, "Look, people are getting interested in astronomy. Finally, they're interested in something I'm interested in." He goes over to the crowd, and the crowd, someone is explaining to them, "Look, there you can see it. See that light? It's the headlights on the mystery airship. Tillinghast is at it again." And everyone's amazed, and Lovecraft, shaking his head, had to explain to them that the mystery airship they were all pointing at was the planet Venus, which was prominent in the West. And he wrote a letter indignant letter into the Providence Sunday Journal that was published saying, people ought to pay attention to astronomy, then they wouldn't confuse airships and planets in the heavens. I should say in Willimantic, the whatever was seen could not have been Venus, however, because Venus was in the west, and in Willimantic, what was seen before Christmas was in the east. And I do have a suspicion it might have been the most brightest of all stars, uh, the Sirius, rising in the southeast. But the accounts in newspapers are not quite good enough to say that's the case. Um, uh, if you've been through Willimantic, if anyone's been through Willimantic, it was an old mill town, and the most important mill was the American Thread Company. They had stone mills from the 19th century and some brick mills spread along the Willimantic River. Some of those have been torn down, and the plant is no longer in business in its original way. But it was in operation at the time, and it was over some of those buildings that the light was seen. And uh, people had gathered down by the railroad tracks to watch this light. There were in 1909, before Prohibition, a number of saloons down there, and I don't want to criticize people unnecessarily, but there may have been some people there. But there was also a more legitimate newsstand there, run by the mayor of the town, Mayor Dunn, and there people gathered. I do wish I could have been able to transport back in time to the crowd of Christmas shoppers of December 1909, to join them on that street corner and look up and see whether it really was serious or whether there was some true mystery airship looping over the mill factories. I suppose with mill factories, you have to worry about someone hoaxing too and sending up a light from the top of the building. But
Yep. Mhm.
alas, when I wrote about this in my Willimantic Skies book several years ago, I was unable to find any 120-year-old witnesses to give me their account. It
It
was
would be interesting if people could have seen it from Lebanon. Because I'm not 120 years old, but when I was a kid, we spent a lot of time looking up at the sky. No light pollution. We had no street lights. It was beautiful.
yeah, even in Willimantic of 1909, the light pollution must have been much less than today, because they were able to watch Halley's Comet from downtown at one time. Um, and even when I was growing up in the 1950s in parts of Willimantic, you still had quite a much darker sky than today. But Lebanon, I'm sure, had really dark skies then. Probably not so dark even in Lebanon today as
It's
it
it's
was.
it's really not. And I remember, what was it, 96? We had Hail Bop come through.
Uh, in 1997, Hillbop, the year before, we had
97.
Comet Hyakutake. So in 96, there was surprise Comet Hyakutake with a nice long tail. The following year, we had Hale-Bopp, which was predicted long in advance, and stuck around much longer. So many people were able to see it, and I remember watching it many a night, um, and I'm sure it attracted the attention in Lebanon. Did you see it?
Oh, yeah. So I had just gotten a trampoline, and my friend from down the street would come over. We would lay on the trampoline and stare at the comet.
I thought you were going to say you would bounce up and down trying to reach it, but
We did. So I would have been, I think, in sixth or seventh grade at the time. And it was,
you're a youngster.
and we were in our, the witchcraft phase that all middle school girls go through. So we would like meditate and stare at the comet and try to take power from the comet. Was one of the things that we did. That was the same age where you're playing like light as a feather, stiff as a board type of thing.
Yes. In
Yep.
1957, one of the things that initially attracted me to astronomy was, after a long lapse, there were two fairly bright comets visible from uh, Willimantic, from the United States generally. And I was able to see one of them. And I was just a little kid at the time, but it's stuck in my memory. And it was also 1957, was a time of a very active sun. So in my growing up years, I was also able to see bright northern lights. And we had a number of occasions that happened in that time period that probably rivaled the northern lights we had a little while ago on May 10, a very strong aurora borealis storm. Uh, in fact, that inspired a kind of interest in the history of northern lights that led me back to the early days of New England, not that long after Willimantic and Windham came into being. This was in 1719. People in New England and somewhat to the south, because the records are much more porous than today, were astounded when the sky turned red and strange lights were seen. They didn't know what it was, and some people were feared that it was a sign of the coming of the end of the world. Um, Cotton Mather, who was remembered not so well because of his role in the Salem witch trials, where he acquiesced in. He wasn't directly involved in the trial, but he supported the use after some thought of spectral evidence, where it was not evidence from based on people, but uh, things that people could claim they were being tormented by the spirit of Goody, whoever the ghost was, allowing that to be used in trials. But he was an interesting character because he was caught between the strict Puritan views and the New Enlightenment. He was a member of the Royal Society in Britain, the fledgling new scientific organization of the day, as well as being, of course, the person who wrote about witches and other phenomena in early New England. And he eventually wrote a pamphlet about it, where he said, yeah, this is the Northern Lights you've seen, people, the Aurora Borealis, but it could also be a sign from God. And he called his pamphlet A Voice from Heaven. Another person who wrote a pamphlet in Boston at the time, 1719, was Thomas Roby, who was much more of a pure enlightenment person. He said, this is the aurora borealis. Everyone agrees on that, but I don't agree that it's a sign of the end of the world or something coming like that. So there were different viewpoints going back to New England times in the early days. And this was the time when Lebanon and Windham, Connecticut, of which Willimantic was a part at the time, is again now, uh, were uh, were not that old. The first town meeting in Windham was in 1692, if I remember correctly, same year as the Salem witch trials, after King Philip's War. I know you're interested in too, but not that long after. And uh, these, I wondered, why were people so excited to see the Northern Lights in 1719? After all, if you're in a place with no light pollution, you can probably see Northern Lights if they act like they do today several times a decade without great difficulty. But in 719, before that, the sun had been in a very quiet episode called the Maunder Minimum. Since about 1645, there'd been very few uh, sunspots, little solar activity, and as a consequence, not much in the way of northern lights. So many of the people in the New England of 1719, even though they grew up with dark skies and stars and similar phenomena, they did not know what the northern lights were, and it was a surprise and astounded them. By the 1730s, they were pretty familiar with what they were, even if they could be awe-inspiring in time. But it's interesting that the behavior of the sun is reflected in the response of the people to this natural phenomenon.
Yeah, and that was interesting to me when I read that chapter in the book, because we tend to think of people in that time period as being, archaic and, you know, driven by religious beliefs, but they even though they did not know exactly what it was, they understood it was a natural occurrence.
Right? They didn't know what caused northern lights back then, and the connection between solar activity and northern lights had not been established in 1719. But both Thomas Roby and Cotton Mather were primed for this because in 1716, a few years before, there had been a big display of northern lights in England that had caused a great stir because there, as in New England, the Maunder minimum had meant that many people grew up without seeing the northern lights very much anyway. And both Cotton Mather and Thomas Roby were aware of this because they read the philosophical transactions of the Royal Society. They had talked with Thomas Prince, who had been over in England in 1716 and seen the aurora over there, who told them about it. So they were kind of primed that to know what they were seeing when it came in 1719. But the average person was not. And until auroras became common enough in ensuing decades to be familiar, they caused some disturbance. Now, there are stories later on from our area that of where northern lights were interpreted in ways that seem unusual. At the time of the Revolutionary War, just before the surrender of Lord Cornwallis, a fellow in Killingly, which is another northeastern
Mhm.
Connecticut town, wrote that he saw in the sky an array of cannons lined up uh, that were visible, and they were a sign of obviously, of the ending of the Revolutionary War, of the victory at Yorktown. And there, of course, no photograph back then as to what he saw, but I have an idea because I've seen an auroral arch arcing across the sky with a whole bunch of little cross pieces of aurora within it. And I'm thinking, that almost looks like a bunch of cannon arrayed in a row. And I suspect that our Killingly venturer saw something like that and interpreted it freely. Uh, Perhaps he interpreted that way after he heard that Cornwallis had surrendered. I don't know if he would have given the same
Mhm.
interpretation had the battle not occurred, but I suspect that that was what he saw because it was a time when the aurora borealis was active.
I just had a conversation with my mother that was interesting. And mom, I'm sorry. Don't get mad at me for telling the story. But she had mentioned when she was a kid, her mother had sent her out to there was like an outbuilding where they stored milk, that it was a dairy farm. Her
Uh-huh.
mother had sent her out to get milk at night, and she saw what she now knows is the northern lights, but as a kid she had no idea what it was. So she's telling me this, and I said, well, what did you think it was? She said, I just thought it was weird.
They are weird and strange and awe-inspiring even after you know what they are. It was in when I was maybe 4 or 5 years old that I was led out one night onto the back steps to look up over Romantic. This was still Romantic at the time, to see these rays rising in the north, and was told they were the Northern Lights. Um, and I thought it was fascinating, but I didn't think that much of it. After all, if you're 4 or 5, you're seeing a lot of new things. And if you're let out by a parent and shown what they are, uh, you think, well, you may think that's really cool, and you may want to see it again, but it doesn't seem unnatural to you because you've been brought to see it in the same way you were shown a bird or a hornet's nest or something like that. But I think that's a good thing. we in teaching science, I think it's important to teach about the natural world too. Perhaps something they did more in the 1800s in some schools at least than they do today, teaching about the wildlife, the birds, the world in which we live, stars included, uh, and not just the science of black holes and wonderful pictures through large telescopes, but things that also I think should teach things that this people can see themselves and explore themselves. Uh, and that I think is more evident in some of the textbooks of the 1800s, the later 1800s anyway, than we see today in modern science textbooks.
Yeah, I was lucky enough as a kid. My grandparents lived up the road just a bit, and my grandmother had been a horticulturalist, and she would take me for walks and teach me about lichens and show me, teach me about the different plants we saw on the walks and things like that. And then my grandfather was a farmer, but he was also a history nerd, local history. One of his favorite things to do was drive anyone who he could trap around and show them where all the one room schoolhouses had been in Lebanon. He knew every single one of them. I want to say it was either 17 or 27. I think 17. But one of those two. He knew where every single one of them was. He had a story about each one. But he'd drive you and show you where it was and tell you about it too. And that gets you more excited when you can look and touch and see things as a kid.
I totally agree. When I was in school, I had some great history teachers, but I do wish that they had been able to fit into the curriculum more local history, talking about Rochambeau's soldiers marching through Windham on the way to join Washington for Yorktown. Uh, I knew of the War Office up in Lebanon and had wandered around the Green up in Lebanon, which is a huge green compared to most common green areas in New England, and had some things pointed out to me, but largely things found out on my own from relatives or plaques or things like that. I wish there had been more of that integrated into locals' uh, history. And in New England, there's a lot of that that could be integrated into local history. Uh,
Absolutely.
Lebanon, perhaps more surviving than in Windham and Willimantic, where I grew up, in terms of revolutionary and colonial times. The old governors' houses. It's harder to find the traces of the old common people's homes, but there were still a lot of old houses around. Not all that reconstructed in Lebanon, as I recall. When I was a kid growing up, you could still imagine how they would have been in colonial times. They probably had additions. They had better windows. They had uh, uh, certainly better paint than would have been
Yes.
used in colonial days. But that led me to wandering around New England gravestones and looking at the old carvings, the funny figures. I wondered, what's that funny head doing on top of that gravestone? That I hope that's not a portrait of the person buried there because it's a very odd looking head. It wasn't, of course, but one of the things I miss being in Michigan is that while we have some very interesting cemeteries going back to uh, the mid 19th century, we don't have those early carvings of skulls and death's heads and with unusual epitaphs that you find so frequently in New England. I will say that I do recall that the father of a famous astronomer is buried in the Lebanon Cemetery, the old Lebanon Cemetery. Uh, if you find a Newcomb in there, he's
Newcomb,
actually
yep.
the
Yep.
son became a famous astronomer. I think it's the son, not the grandson, but I could have that wrong. Simon Newcomb became a very well-known astronomer, and apparently was a rather irascible fellow himself, but wrote popular books too in the later 1800s and into the early 1900s.
Is he in the
So
same one as Trumbull? That
I
one?
believe he is the one that's. If you start at the south end of the green and go off to the uh,
Past the
just the
elementary school?
east, maybe, yeah, that
Yep.
it's down there, and he's Newcomb, the astronomer Newcomb isn't there, but the father or perhaps grandfather is, and so I didn't discover that until long after I had left the Willimantic, so I was sorry I hadn't known about that connection beforehand. But I don't suppose there's reason to raise a plaque to someone for being the father of someone who later became known to a small group of astronomers.
There would be quite a few plaques in Lebanon if that kind of thing were common.
That is certainly true. Um,
Yep.
the So I do miss that aspect of New England history. Of course, history in Michigan goes back as far, and we do have uh, things built by Native Americans, not so much in stone usually as in New England, perhaps, because there isn't as much in the area of Michigan I'm now. There isn't so much surface stone, which I'm sure the farmers mostly enjoyed, but there are remnants, some aspects of mound building cultures that are usually associated more widely with things further south in Indiana and Ohio, where you have, of course, some of those really spectacular mounds, a number of which may have astronomical alignments built into them, uh, and very interesting structures. But the cultures or related cultures, at least, did extend up into Michigan, where we also have in the northern part of the state the old Native American copper mines, because it's very rich and very pure copper.
Yep. I just today was sent a video clip from Michigan about little people, but it was perhaps Charles Fort level of audacious. Um, so it was a man that said it was 2011 that his very small town was raided by about 100 little people that stole 3 babies from them. And they never reported it or did anything because the little people threatened them not to. And I
That
just find it
I have not
hard.
heard.
I find it hard to believe that 3 babies get stolen and you don't do anything about it. Um, it it
I agree.
it
Uh,
reminded me of some of, the old Art Bell episodes. Um, it was actually a letter written into a podcast, so anonymous also.
Art Bell, who I've only heard a few of his programs, but he used to be very have a very good approach to some really odd stories that he would hear. He would he was able to draw out the storytellers in a way that's perhaps more interesting than most. But I wouldn't take everything that came into Art Bell as being necessarily something that actually happened. Um, there are a lot of stories in Michigan, of course, a number of them involving cryptids and Bigfoot-like creatures. There's a lot of swamp. There's a lot of forest still in Michigan. Um, and there are areas of the state that are grown up forested now that in the heyday of the lumbering era in the 19th century were completely clear cut down to the ground. Wide areas were, but they've grown up again in foliage in the subsequent years. And there are a lot of stories involved those stories of fires in the past, stories of a story that's real, but I don't know quite how much of it is real at the present time, is right in the evening before Thanksgiving Day of 1919, the southeastern portion, the southwestern portion of Michigan was shaken by loud, thunderous noises. There were lights in the sky. Some reports said power plants and phone service was knocked out. And it's been interpreted as an airburst of a large meteor at the time, although no meteorite has yet been recovered. But it's an interesting story I've been trying to investigate a little further. Of course, 1919, there's no one alive to interview now, but the appeared in a lot of newspapers, but the newspaper accounts and the stories researched at the time are not always in agreement, and that's not surprising. Meteorite hunters always find when they go out to interview people who saw a bright meteor, well, it's something you're not prepared for. Suddenly, a brilliant object appears in the sky. Maybe now you have your camera out and ready to record it, but before then you didn't. And tracing down the exact path of the meteor enough to find a meteorite can be a difficult thing. Of course, in Michigan, the meteorite probably went into a swamp anyway, so
And
it'd be hard.
unless you have like several people in different areas to kind of triangulate it, I don't think I would be able to judge how far it was away
Right,
or,
that's absolutely necessary. And if you do see a very bright meteor, or what you think is a very bright meteor, I encourage people to just report it by answering the questions on the American Meteor Society Fireball log, which is on the web. And then if they get enough observations from people in different areas, they they'll make a map. If they get five or more, I think they'll put it on a map and show the directions everyone was thought they were looking to see the meteor. And if they get enough observations, you can sometimes quite well define the path of the meteor through the sky. And of course, most of these don't lead to meteorites, but it's still interesting to see themselves. And I encourage people, wherever you are, this isn't just for Michigan, to, if you see a bright fireball, report it there. And if other people report it, you can find out roughly at least how far away it was from your location, what direction it was moving in. It's very hard if you're the only observer. I've had people say the meteor went right down, landed right behind my barn over there. When you add in the other observations, you realize it went hundreds of miles away, and what people were seeing was it was just went down out of sight behind their barn, but kept on going. So it's really hard to tell if you're the lone observer, unless it knocks you on the head or something. Then you can say where it was.
So I just have one more question to end on. So if you see something that's not a meteorite, a UFO possibly. So if I saw one finally, I would tell you for sure. But for anyone else, who do you feel you report a UFO to? Is that for
I
astronomers
don't
or
know
is
that there
there
is, yeah, a good question, because I don't know that there is a good single reporting system yet. Um, First of all, you might want to make sure it's not something already well known. And around where I am in near East Lansing, Michigan, the place that usually gets most of those calls is Planetarium, Abrams Planetarium, the public face of astronomy in the area. And they can maybe say, yeah, I got a lot of calls about that. It looks like it's probably a meteor, and report it to the American Fireball Society. Or they can say, no, you're the only one I've heard from about that. So I don't and I don't know what it is. There are, of course, things like MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, have their own recording systems. And there had been some talk of setting up some kind of recording system with the latest government attention to UFOs. But as far as I am aware, that nothing like that has been done yet. There was a National UFO Reporting Center, a website, not that long ago. I don't know if it's been changed now, where one could report such observations. But I don't really have an entirely satisfactory result for things that are not more meteor-like. Um, and Whether an astronomer is the right person to talk to, well, maybe, maybe not. You remember, if your object is going to be swamp gas, well, an astronomer may not know more about swamp gas than your next door neighbor, as I've said. So maybe astronomer won't be able to tell you anything. If the object is Venus in the west and you think it's Tillinghast airship, then an astronomer is helpful. An astronomer can say, yeah, that's Venus over there, likely. If it's a meteor or something, perhaps re-entering satellite, adding your observations to the American Meteor Society fireball log and then going back a few days later to see what other people have reported is probably the best way to see what's going on. But if it's something that landed behind your house, I don't know that there really is a good reporting network on the national level, or where I could recommend to everyone. And reporting that thing behind your house to your local planetarium probably won't help because, as I said, they're astronomers. They're not going to know unless it's a meteorite. They probably won't know anything about it. But so I don't have a good answer to that. Perhaps some of your listeners will have a better answer than I do.
Yeah, I would say cross your fingers it is a meteorite because those are worth quite a bit, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. They can be. It depends on who owns it. You can't find a meteorite on someone else's property and take it and sell it. In most places, anyway, in the U.S., it's the person whose property it lands on who owns it. And that may not be the law in every state. So I don't know. But I hope, even if you find one, I hope you'll save a piece or have a piece devoted to scientific testing and evaluation so that the science of the meteorites, some of these are the big iron meteorites that you're familiar with, for example, from around Meteor Crater in Arizona. But some are more stony. Some have lots of carbon in them and are very interesting for the chemistry of the solar system. And so, if you should be so lucky, and it's not something most of us have to worry about, is to find a meteor right in your backyard, yes, it can be very valuable, depending on particularly how rare the meteorite type is and how many meteorite collectors want to have it. But don't forget don't forget to let science have a look at it. We have a number. The Abrams Planetarium at Michigan State University has a number of meteorites on display, including a number that fell in Michigan and often didn't get lost in the swamp when it did so. And they're great fun to look at, and donating to, if you have the ability to do so, donating to a local science place is a great way to improve information about the meteorite, get it known to science, but also improve science education in your area.
And take your kids outside to go look at stuff.
Please do. Try to, if you have bright lights on at night, if you don't really need them, please turn them off or shield them so they don't produce excess light pollution. Um, And remember that the sky is always wonderful to look at. Northern lights, meteors, just the stars and constellations are amazing to see, and certainly something that everyone should see and be able to admire. And I hope we'll be able to trim back on the light pollution so that the many people in urban settings are able to enjoy the night sky more than they do right now. I think that can be done safely by and still provide the illumination people need on walkways and things where they need to proceed without, after all, the light shining up into the sky is just wasted light for the most part. You're trying to illuminate the ground, not the heavens.
Absolutely. Yep. Well, thank you very much. This was fascinating. I don't
Well,
think I
thank you.
successfully defended Fort, but
Well, thank you for letting me ramble, and as I'm sure I did, and I hope some people will find parts of this interesting. And if they go out and look at the skies, that's well enough without worrying about
absolutely.
Fort or or worrying if astronomers were fairly treated or unfairly, or worrying about swamp gas. Go out and enjoy the world around you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Horace. I will put your books in the show notes. Everyone check out some of Horace's books. I will recommend off the top of my head Willimantic Skies to start with, but there are some other ones out there.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Have a good night.